Right, so it's time to start the webinar. So thank you very much for joining us today for this webinar on opportunities in LATAM solar energy markets. This webinar is brought to you by ATA Insights, and today we'll have two speakers who know the Latin American energy and solar energy markets very well. They are Stephen Hill from Evershed Sutherland and Carlos and James from Wood. So I'll let them introduce themselves briefly. So Carlos, would you mind introducing yourself in briefly, please?
Sure, you can hear me?
Yes.
Great. Well, good morning or good afternoon to everyone. Carlos St. James here. I'm the director for strategic development for the Americas for Wood, a Scottish engineering firm. Very happy to be here. Thank you.
And Stephen, thank you, Carlos. Stephen, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Carlos, and good morning, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Stephen Hill. I'm a partner in the energy and infrastructure team at Evershed Sutherland, a global law firm investing actually for a number of developers, sponsors, and utilities in the renewable energy market globally, but in particular in Latin America.
Great, thank you, Stephen. So, right, without further ado, we'll start with the first presentation. So, Stephen, if you'd like to share your screen, please.
There we go. Thank you, Carlos, again, and as I say, welcome everybody. So what I'm going to focus on in this short period is just talking generally about the opportunities, and I would like to give a bit of focus around that as to where we see it, but then thinking particularly of what are the key drivers in the market at the moment, particularly the government programs, and a bit of insight or our thoughts around the private PPA market, which is currently at the beginning of its life cycle, but actually we think it's something that's really going to grow in the market as well as globally. I want to start off by just giving a bit of background to the region as a whole. I'm conscious we're talking about an entire continent here, so a lot of things that we could cover, but I think it's important just to look at it from a macroeconomic perspective. And importantly, a lot of what we see is the movement of global funds to numerous different areas around the globe, and therefore people can move their dollars, their euros, their sterling, etc., to many different jurisdictions. And this is quite an interesting chart that's been produced by EY and relates to their renewable energy country attractiveness index. I think there's a bit of context between certain of the countries in LATAM against other countries. And you'll see from this, and hopefully everyone can view this, and it'll be on the slide circulated later, you know, there are a number of countries within LATAM that feature in the top 15 most attractive countries around the globe. They include Chile, Mexico, and Argentina. And that's notwithstanding any particular macroeconomic areas there. There are some real drivers that are providing opportunities for people. In addition, Brazil features in the top 20, and further down in this, Peru ranks number 31. Clearly, there are other countries and other jurisdictions, but within the top 40 globally, EY don't consider them to be part of that. And that's driven by a number of different things. So if I look at Brazil, one of the things driving their attractiveness is the fairly recent, well, end of last year, they managed to procure 1.4 gigawatts of wind capacity to be operational by 2023. So obviously a clear driver for opportunities there. And I know that we and a number of my colleagues are doing a number of investments in certain of the LATAM countries there. We're also looking at a number of secondary and tertiary acquisitions of projects, and that's obviously going to a lower cost of capital. The final driver we see at a macro level is the need for finance, and the finance is not coming necessarily from development banks, but actually through individual funds and corporates investing direct. I'll talk in a bit more detail on that when we come to the private PPAs. So just looking at the government incentives, And this is a not too complicated slide, but obviously there's a lot of information here, so I don't intend to go through it in detail, and obviously this will be available afterwards. I think the key thing to note is that a lot of the incentives around this are driven by tax incentives, so not dissimilar to the US model, but different to some of the other models we see in some of the European and Far Eastern jurisdictions. So, for example, there is limited feed-in tariffs available in the 5 main countries listed here, and there's no contracts for difference, which can be a structure used by other jurisdictions. What is generally driving it is tax incentives in numerous different ways, some of which are detailed on there. And the only slight exception to that is Chile, which has a renewable energy certification system driving large companies and utilities that will be penalised if they're not generating sufficient or using sufficient energy from renewable sources. I then thought, given we're focusing on opportunities here, we would just put a quick column in there about the upcoming tenders, just so that people have these on their radar. I suspect most people will be familiar with these, but I think it's worthwhile just being cognizant of them. So looking at Argentina, there's a round 3 auction coming up by the end of this year. There's been a number of tenders in Brazil, one of which I referenced earlier at the back end of last year and earlier this year, Q2 this year. Chile recently awarded around 600 megawatts of renewable power, including solar, in 2017, and some ongoing tenders around those. Colombia are expecting tenders within the next year. And then Mexico is going through, currently going through its 4th auction for electricity from renewable sources at the moment. And that's obviously something that many people on this webinar will be familiar with. We'll come on to the end, but we've got this in more detail, which is hyperlinked to this slide. So when these slides are circulated, you'll be able to see this in more detail, plus some additional information about both local content and also government targets, which is obviously driving a lot of this investment. I want to talk now about private PPAs. This is a rather than a top-down, so government-led procurement process. There are a number of new structures around private power purchase agreement, PPAs. Just talk about those generally. So this tends to deliver better off-taker liquidity. There's more generators to which you can talk to rather than the local federal utility there. It gives price certainty. Now, obviously, utilities do that as well, but, or the government does that as well. But actually, these are bilateral arrangements, and you can get a lot more detail around that. And quite often, it gives you a floor price. And the floor price is important for external, in particular, bank debt to come in and be able to support that. I'll come on to some of the risks associated with that in the next slide. Increasingly, we're seeing that green credentials, a long time ago, green credentials were the real driver for this. And actually, that's slightly fallen off the bandwagon slightly. But what is now driving it are some of the major corporates targeting some of the youth market are looking at increasing their green credentials globally, but also in LATAM. And then just looking at the final one, security of supply, there are transmission and distribution risk for the conveyance of power, but actually if you're on site for that large energy supplier, having that security of supply benefits both parties, both the off-taker and the generator. And we're seeing increasing use for particularly multinational companies requiring that. Looking into what's really driving in LATAM, as this, so those were global drivers, more in LATAM, this provides a route to market, ability to bypass government and utilities, and actually, as I mentioned earlier, greater availability of potential off-takers. Creditworthiness, the big issue around PPAs is creditworthiness, but I know given some of the macroeconomic issues in some of the jurisdictions in LATAM, arguably the credit rating of some of the major corporates can be beneficial. And then finally, government has, as we all know, had policy delays in the past, and you can circumvent those and bypass those by going straight to market and straight to an individual off-taker. Finally, just talk about some of the risk items. I mentioned credit or counterparty strength and creditworthiness, and that is an issue that will need to be backed. You can get credit insurance. We're also seeing increased use of the aggregation model, whereby rather than going to a single off-taker, you go to multiples. Clearly, you have an obligation to deliver. Quite often, it's a take or pay arrangement, so you know you're going to be able to sell the power, but it also has an obligation on you to sell the power and deliver that power. And failure to do that has penalty repercussions. And then finally, PPAs are reasonably new and less established. And I give the example of one of my Chilean colleagues who was asked to supply a standard PPA and said, there is no such thing as a standard PPA. I've got a blank bit of paper, I will draft you what you need to be drafted. Which sort of works at one level, but of course does mean that both parties by definition are slightly less experienced. But clearly that experience is growing, and myself and Carlos were clearly delighted to assist on that. As I mentioned earlier, there's more detail in our comparative table, which we've put together as a global law firm. People are welcome to download that. And with that, Carlos Marquez, I'm done on my presentation and look forward to hearing any comments or questions from the audience.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for the presentation. We are seeing a few questions coming in through the Q&A box, but I would like to remind the audience that you can submit questions. Please do. You'll find the Q&A box at the bottom toolbar. Well, next we'll have Carlos and James from Wood. So Carlos, could you well, first, Stephen, we need you to stop sharing your presentation, and then Carlos can share his.
Great. Can you guys still hear me?
We can hear you very well.
Perfect.
Yes.
Okay, Carlos St. James here. Thank you, Stephen, for that presentation. And we could just about forego my presentation because there's so much stuff to talk about there just in what you presented that we could spend the next hour just discussing that stuff. But let me stick to my commitment here and actually go and share. And I have to do this. And let's see, is everyone seeing? There we go. Are we all on the same page here, the starter? Okay, perfect. Well, thank you. Just a quick discussion on Wood, on my employer, just to establish credibility and where we're coming from. Wood is a giant Scottish-based engineering firm. We recently absorbed other companies such as Skur Energy, which I think in Latin America, a lot of people still know us by our old name, Skur Energy. It's now actually Wood. That's the new name. Skur no longer exists, but we're 55,000 employees worldwide. We have offices in 60 countries. It's a giant organization, and within Latin America specifically, just so you know, our offices are in Mexico, in Trinidad and Tobago, in Colombia, in Peru, Brazil, Chile, and we're in Argentina as well. We have well over 1,000 employees in Latin America alone, doing all kinds of engineering. On the renewable energy side, of course, we're involved in all. The topic that's of interest today is solar, but as you can see, we're actually very active now in offshore wind, which is really coming on strong in North America, and energy storage, which is also kind of like the holy grail coming on as well. We pretty much have offerings, services and products anywhere along the life cycle, be it feasibility all the way through decommissioning. Actually, we have engineers specialized in those areas. So now getting to the nitty gritty here. This is a graph that in one form or another, I think everyone has seen, right? The one we want to focus on here is actually the one that's kind of yellowish or golden in color. The photovoltaic levelized cost of energy. It's dropped like a stone since 2009. This is significant because it kind of competes with that bottom line that we see with onshore wind, which is at fairly flat and hasn't been going anywhere. This is one of the reasons why onshore wind is perceived as a more mature technology. It's not changing as much, whereas solar photovoltaic, certainly, as we're seeing here in this, has dropped significantly in its price and cost. Now, that drop in price has, of course, led to this chart here. And what happened specifically in the year 2010, we see that on a global level, investment in solar energy worldwide has exceeded and won over on onshore wind consistently over since that year. It makes sense. Now, what's interesting is that Latin America, that is not really the case. Latin America has a long-standing love affair with wind, and only recently is Latin America beginning to embrace solar. So solar is just starting to take off in Latin America, and this is important because actually it's being able to take advantage of the even lower pricing and newer technologies such as bifacial, etc. So Latin America is really well positioned now as it really ramps up its investments in solar. So let's take a look specifically of where in Latin America is the investment. If you see that first column there on the left, this is data from a year or so ago. Latin America has about 20 gigawatts worth of wind and solar installed. More than the specific numbers, take a look at the disparity there. There's like a 10-to-1 ratio. There's so much more wind installed than there is solar right now. Now, in the next few years, that's actually going to start changing dramatically. Note here, as I uncover these, that the percentage growth in solar is going to be, of course, it's a very impressive percentage, 450-odd%. But of course, that's only because it's starting from a very low number. But note here that by 2020, installed capacity is going to more than double to some 46 or 47 gigawatts, but there's still going to be twice as much wind installed than solar. Now, note also, of course, solar is doing a great job of catching up. There's just a lot going on. Now, note in the third column, in gigawatts, there's a 12.4 gigawatts of solar coming on. Let's start looking at that number specifically. In the next few years, there's going to be 12.4 gigawatts that are expected to come online in Latin America. So let's take a look at where exactly that's coming on. And here is the chart. So this is the 12.4 broken down kind of by sub-region within Latin America. And as you can see, of course, Mexico is 7 gigawatts. It's the dominant player in solar. What's unusual about this is that usually it's Brazil. Whenever we see a chart that has something to do with Latin America, usually Brazil is the 800-pound gorilla, right? It's the dominant player, etc. And in recent years, for a bunch of reasons, which I'll get into in a moment, Brazil has kind of stepped aside, and Mexico has done a great job of really taking leadership in the region as far as attracting investment, getting things going. Their energy reforms are enormous, they're complex, they're behind schedule, there's a lot of things to complain about, but there's so much more that's going right in Mexico, and we're seeing it by the fact that just in solar, there's some 7 gigawatts that are coming online in the next few years, regardless of price, and I know we can actually have another discussion on just how terribly low those prices are in Mexico specifically. But let's take another look even closer and break that down, those 12.4 gigawatts, break them down country by country. And here's the chart. This is a breakdown by country. I'll let you take a look at that in case you're interested in a specific country. The percentage growth in the next few years actually is kind of irrelevant. I actually should have covered it up because in the case of Argentina, for example, the fact that it's going to grow by some 10,000% really is meaningless. It just reveals that Argentina is starting from a very small base, right? But the thing to look at here is the big players, the big numbers are the usual suspects, right? It's Mexico, Brazil, Chile, Argentina. Those are the top players there. We see them at the top of the list. What's noteworthy is that the fourth largest economy in Latin America is Colombia. And look, if you see there towards the middle in the Andean region, Colombia is kind of still slow to come online. And we can discuss that a little bit as well. Colombia's lagging. There's really no other way. And if you happen to actually love Colombia, take a look at Peru. If you like the Andean region, Peru and Ecuador, actually, there's a lot going on there in the next few years just in solar. Now, there's another thing going on at the same time that all this is playing out, is what we see here now in this graph. We're showing investment in renewables in Latin America since 2004. And what we see typically is the historic dominance of Brazil. Now, in the early years, the early 4000s, when Brazil and that green line was just clearly the big recipient of all investment, that was driven by two technologies. One, biofuels, and specifically ethanol and biodiesel. Brazil did a great job of investing in that. And there's also the tail end of that actually started Brazil has over 10 gigawatts of installed wind capacity right now. And we can discuss that as well, actually, how their PPAs are in reais and local currency, and that their primary funding source actually is the BNDES, the Brazilian Development Bank. As a side note, before I forget this little point, one thing that's happening now is in Brazil, being Brazil, they always insist that they want their chain to be developed in Brazil, right? They want job creation in country, etc. And they can force that issue because the reais are in local currency. the PPAs are in local currencies, and BNDES, the development bank, would typically finance all of that. Now in solar, that's much harder to achieve, right? The solar panels typically are coming from China or from overseas. There isn't that much more of a value chain that you can create in country. And as of this year, BNDES is actually taking a very close look at changing their rules so that they can actually finance projects that are coming from overseas. And that's going to be an important thing for the development of the solar industry, which is only just starting to take off in Brazil. But back to this graph now, what we see is in recent years, Brazil, of course, had its political and economic troubles, and we can see the drop in investment because of that. And the rest of Latin America has continued to grow, right? And we see along the way that Mexico has actually really become a leader in the region, et cetera. It continues to grow. These numbers are a little bit outdated. It only goes to 2015, but if we stretch them out another couple of years, what you'll see from Brazil is it's consistently receiving somewhere in the area of about $6 billion US dollars a year in investment in renewables, and Latin America continues being up there as well. So that disparity remains. Oh, and here's actually some specific numbers. Last year, just last year, Brazil and Mexico received about the same amount of investment, $6 billion. And then what we see is the usual stuff, right? The big economies, Argentina is kind of coming out of nowhere. It's also a laggard. It's just coming on. It's this year, Argentina is the current darling of investment. Everyone's looking at Argentina. Chile is there, very strong always for such a small economy. They've been receiving enormous amounts of investment. And then the bottom half of that ranking is typically the smaller economies, right? You see at any given year, there's a different country from Central America playing. Sometimes you see somebody from the Caribbean coming up, etc. But also noteworthy here in last year is the fourth largest economy, Colombia, doesn't exist. It's not on the rankings at all. And that's one of the upcoming stories, I think. And here we have actually this is a map of Colombia. This is a solar radiation map. And note, red, by the way, means a whole bunch of solar radiation or solar resources. And if you can see, up in the north, the center there, jutting into the Caribbean, we have the peninsula de Guajira, is it? I think, yeah, it's called Guajira, where the single best solar radiation, and for that matter, actually the best wind, also happens to be in Guajira. But if we overlap on this map, where is the transmission grid in Colombia? There we see that there is pretty much no transmission grid in the Guajira. The government only now is finally getting around to building that, but there is no shortage of issues to be addressed in Colombia, not the least of which, especially, there's a lot of people developing projects in Guajira because it's kind of descampado. There's just a lot of open land there. Make sure that you're tying up your loose ends early on and engaging the communities locally, making sure that your equator principles are being addressed, because when you get to the banks will not lend money for your projects unless you've actually done all your homework and you've engaged the local community and you've done that homework. We've seen in Mexico with projects in Yucatan and things like that where they're getting delayed, and that costs money because people didn't actually tie up their loose ends early up enough. And I fear that Colombia may end up repeating the same mistakes that Mexico made. Hopefully they don't. And this, I think, is my last slide here. This one, I just took it up from a press release I saw yesterday on distributed energy, which is also a hot topic coming on. Mexico is doing a great job on distributed energy, and Brazil as well. Here, the Brazilian Solar Association yesterday, I think, announced that they've just reached 300 megawatts worth of installed capacity and distributed energy in Brazil. That represents an investment of around 2 billion Brazilian reais, or something like 500 million US dollars. And again, I understand this is a little bit blurry, sorry for that actually, but the thing to note on the donut here, graph on the right side, the yellow means it's residential installed capacity, and blue is commercial. Green is industrial. Now, what's unusual about this graph, what's noteworthy about this one is the enormous amount of blue in there. Typically, when you see what's being installed in distributed energy in any given country, is dominated what here would be yellow. It's all residential. People at homes installing solar panels on their rooftops, etc. Brazil is somewhat different, and we can see there's that blue is actually commercial rooftops. We're talking on the roofs of commercial centers, of shopping centers, etc. Attractive from a business standpoint. The business model can be easier to put together because these are deals that are a little bit larger in size on average than the residential typically. So again, I think this is an indication that Brazil on the solar non-utility scale stuff is actually doing it really well. And by the way, these numbers that we're seeing here, this 300 megawatts installed, actually half of it, about 50% of it, is being invested in 3 states, Minas Gerais, Rio Grande do Sul, and São Paulo. So those are the 3 states that are kind of attracting the lion's share of investment in Brazil in solar distributed energy. And there's a great story there as well. But everywhere, there's really no shortage of great stories to tell. I hope this has been kind of like interesting to you, to open doors about what might or might not be interesting to you, or where you see some pitfalls, or specifically some opportunities. So with that, I'll pass it back on to you, Carlos. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carlos, for your presentation. Very interesting. So, right, so just so you know, to all of the members of our audience, we will share the recording and presentations. So you will definitely get those. And right, we have been getting a few questions actually through the Q&A box. So let's look at those now, and hopefully you'll be able to shed some light on these issues. So Joanna Mejia asks, what are the main challenges for asset managers in LATAM? I don't know who wants to go first and answer this question.
If I may, I'm still online. Steve, I'm sorry if I cut you off there. Yeah, one of the things that we do at Wood, actually, also we administer these assets. It's an ongoing issue as well, to make sure that they operate as efficiently as they could, as well as they promised the bankers that they would. There's often an issue there as well. It's a very nascent business model in Latin America, given that there isn't all that much installed capacity in the region. It's growing in importance, and what we're seeing is there's a lot of small businesses looking to do it. What I think is going to end up happening, which is what happens everywhere, is that the giant companies who actually do this professionally are going to end up dominating that business and actually administering a lot of those businesses. Enel, for example, Enel Green Power is one of the biggest investors and developers of renewable energy projects across Latin America. They do it on a large scale. They do it at ridiculously low prices. They're very effective. They're just really good at it. They have a track record. And what they end up doing typically is they sell off those assets, but they maintain the asset management side of it. So they maintain those long-term contracts, and they administer the projects that they themselves built, which I think is a great business model for them as well.
I would only add to that and echo Carlos's comments. I think in every other jurisdiction we've seen there's a consolidation amongst asset manager providers, and they effectively buy in those assets, and then they, with the scale that they can deploy, they can do it in a very cost-effective way. And I'd also say that a lot of the money is coming internationally, so people want someone on the ground who can actually understand that. Typically, the thing that is the most common question asked of us when it comes to international developers or international funders or asset managers is around security and making sure, and that might be slight paranoia and it might be unfair, but that's typically the question. The rest of the asset manager type arrangements are generic around the globe, and we all know solar is more straightforward than say wind, which would have a greater requirement for an asset manager to look after the data and make sure that they're spinning, and that the O&M provider is dealing with what they should be dealing with. So there's a bit of can be a crossover between the O&M provider and the asset manager.
Thank you very much, Stephen. So I think we have answered or at least provided some guidance on that question. So next question is is directed at Carlos and James. So Ignacio Lucas is saying that you show a focus of 24 megawatts in Colombia until 2020, but now there are more than 100 megawatts under construction. Should these numbers be corrected? Meaning, I think the numbers in your forecast. And what is your opinion about the forecast for solar in Colombia? So
yeah, the numbers, by the way, are most of those numbers, and I think I acknowledged it on some of the slides, are mostly Bloomberg New Energy Finance. They do good numbers. In some cases, actually, I have my own numbers that I follow, kind of thing. So I come up with a purge. Of course, they aren't. The data may not be perfect, and Ignacio, thanks for pointing that out. The number may well be higher in Colombia. I can be skeptical about it. I tend to be a little bit. Colombia has taken its sweet time in getting its act together on renewables. It's a country that, Lord knows, needs to diversify its technology risk. It's a little bit too dependent on hydro, and it's paid a terrible price for that, right? They have years of an abundance of hydro and water and low prices, and then years where they have sequías, droughts, and suddenly there's brownouts and blackouts and things like that. And it's been a little bit too political of a process. There may well be 100 megawatts of solar under contract. We'll see. I guess those are mostly private PPAs. The government has claimed for some time now that they're going to have an auction for utility scale stuff. They've been promising it for a long time. Last I heard that it'll be the second half of this year. Odds are that it'll likely turn into sometime next year. But I don't know. I would love for Colombia to be next year's hot little darling, in the same way that this year it's Argentina. Colombia will have its time, but it may not be this year. It isn't this year. I'm hoping it might be next year, but it might not even be. Colombia has demonstrated an ability to be really slow on this. So it's up to them to prove otherwise.
Stephen, thank you, Carlos, for your answer. Stephen, would you like to add anything on the Colombian market?
We still see Colombia as unfortunately, a fairly nascent market. Infrastructure not being in there as much as it needs to be. A very detailed conversation with my colleagues the other day about the crossover between actually Chile and Colombia. And actually, whilst he sees that as growing in the next 2 years, I think the next 6 months, I don't think he really saw it taking off. But actually, interestingly, he did see that as being somewhere that could be real opportunities. I echo Carlos's point that actually it'd be great to see that really taking off. There are some good opportunities there. I just don't think they're there quite yet.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much. So we'll, questions keep on coming in. So thank you to all of you in the audience who are sending questions. So next question takes us to Chile and Argentina. They're asking, Martin Libra asks, what are the main sources of financing for new projects in Chile and Argentina?
Well, those are gracias, Martin. Those are two different worlds. I mean, we have Chile, who's investment grade and has been investment grade for some time. It is the place where typically when an investor is looking to go into Latin America for the first time, they start with Chile, right? It's called Latin America for beginners is Chile. It's the first place you go to because they have the most transparent system. They have a good banking system. Promises are kept, kind of thing. And that's one of the reasons why Chile has gotten so hyper competitive. Everybody wants to do business in Chile, right? Now, across the Andes, and you have a different situation. Argentina just, 2 weeks ago, went from frontier, and we're talking bottom of the barrel stuff, they just crossed the line into emerging market now, right? They have a long way to go to get to somewhere close to investment grade. And given that track record, of course, it makes sense that the banks who typically do the project finance, which is the model that, which it's the most common financial product for renewables in Latin America, and it's actually becoming a dinosaur too. We need new financial solutions for financing renewable projects, but let's just stick to project finance, the nice traditional model, kind of standalone. The banks who do that are typically the Spanish banks, but a lot of European banks do this stuff. They're still shy about lending in Argentina, and while they may love what the Renovar program is doing and how the new government is taking track of it, their credit committees only allow them a certain amount of money to have exposure in Argentina. And those exposure levels have to compete not just with renewable lending, but with other energy lending, with other infrastructure lending, etc. And so they have to fight for those allocations, and they tend to be very small. So the single biggest problem Argentina has right now is getting the financing. In Argentina, every other stakeholder is at the table and ready to do business. The government's done a great job, really, of establishing credibility. Again, they have a great framework with the Renovar programs and the guarantees that they've gotten from the World Bank for the off-taker, Camesa, which is not a particularly good credit risk, and they solve that. Investors are very interested in it because the returns can theoretically be very high. The vendors and technology providers are very active there, setting up shop and looking to do business. All of the pieces of the puzzle are there, except for the bankers. And so all of that, the heavy lifting right now has to be done by the development banks. And so we're seeing the Inter-American Bank and the IFC and the CAF, Corporación Andina de Fomento, doing a lot of that stuff, supplemented then by the ECAs, the export credit agencies, who are lending into Argentina approved, not because Argentina is necessarily a good credit risk, but because they're looking to create jobs, right? The Danish Export Credit Agency will finance projects into Argentina because that creates jobs for Vestas wind turbines getting manufactured there, etc. And so some banks will step in as long as there's some kind of guarantee from either an ECA or from a development bank of one kind or another. And that's the single biggest hurdle Argentina has right now. And that we can discuss like for a whole hour just what's going on in Argentina and this challenge of financing. But let me leave it at that. Stephen, what are your thoughts?
I'm in danger of violently agreeing to everything you're saying, Carlos. Argentina being open about it, we are seeing very little investment. There is still a huge nervousness in the investment community, and that's notwithstanding that guarantees are coming in from the World Bank. We should have thought would underpin investment there, but that is not what we are seeing. And the macroeconomic situation in Argentina is being prohibitive for investment there, which is unfortunate. In Chile, I agree, project financing model and is a great first port of call. Interestingly, the other thing we're seeing for Chile is family houses and family offices coming in, particularly from some of the tax structures like Luxembourg, etc. Large amounts of cash able to be deployed. Lots of the funds held in Luxembourg funds actually come from Latin American families who are looking to deploy capital back into the region, and actually we're finding quite a lot of investment through that as an alternative funding structure, which actually has quite a bit more flexibility than traditional project financing, which, as people will know, is a very rigorous and difficult to be flexible to certain of the structures, and has some quite sometimes draconian, but certainly some onerous provisions around them, whereas the family offices are able to work around those and be slightly more flexible. So it's quite an interesting alternative finance source. Actually,
that's a good point. If I can add to that, actually, in the case of solar specifically, actually, it's easier to come up with a smaller project, a smaller capacity in megawatts, than in wind. Typically, you typically need more scale on the wind side than on solar, and that actually could work to Argentina's advantage. Argentina, especially more than the rest of Latin America, has a big love affair with wind and the Patagonia and all that stuff, and it's taking them a little bit longer to really embrace solar. Although up in the northwest, up there in the Atacama Desert, the radiation is spectacular, right? They can actually come up with projects that are smaller in size. By smaller, I mean 20 megawatts instead of 100 megawatts, which then that family office that Stephen is mentioning, or the equity side, may well put up the entire amount of capital to get those things built. And then once they're up and running, then you can actually refinance things and find someone who's actually willing to buy the cash flow from that and finance it over a period of time. So there's different ways to do it, and solar is particularly well positioned to pull that off. And you can do it because you can get away with smaller solar deals than wind.
Right. Well, thank you very much for your answers. We have a question here which I think is related, which is about the type of contracts that are signed. So the question comes from Luis Laguna, and it reads that the trend in Europe is for solar projects to increasingly go towards merchant and less towards contracted PPAs. Do you see this as being the trend going forward in the big LATAM markets, i.e. Mexico? What is your view on on merchant in LATAM?
Stephen, you want to start? I have no shortage of opinions on this, but you want to go, Stephen?
Yeah, so I can probably talk about, so I'm based in London, so I see the European trend. I think it's an interesting one about the contracted PPA, and I don't want to spend too long in Europe, but we saw PPAs in Europe increase significantly recently, but have actually tailed off in the last 18 months or so. I think it does have some real benefits to having a PPA, and I think particularly the benefit of a PPA is that you're able to get a floor price, and as soon as you can get a floor price, you can create greater certainty, and that allows opportunities for different funding structures, particularly on the debt side. So, I question in all jurisdictions whether we're seeing a pure merchant risk coming through rather than contracted PPA. and then I seem to have lost the question. So experience in LATAM. I think most of the projects, so some of the solar projects that we're seeing, are a mix of contracted and merchant, albeit particularly two of our clients at the moment are really focusing on the PPA market. But that's because they're able to undertake that through private wires. So I think the moment you can get a private wire arrangement, you increase the ability to go direct into a corporate PPA. And if you're providing solar, this is probably on the smaller parts, but if you're providing that direct on a PPA on a host site on a contracted PPA, certainly makes some sense. And then the final point on that, you can have sleeved PPAs, so not necessarily being on site, but being able to sell the power, even if you're not next door to the relevant host site, to that off-taker, and that can work quite well. Whether that takes off in LATAM, I think is still to be determined. But given the lack of government subsidy around it, you can see that taking a full merchant risk could be quite punchy for some investors.
Yeah, and Stephen nailed it, actually. Matter of fact, if this were a football match, I would seriously be considering pulling out a yellow card at this point. It's certainly fully merchant is a scary thing. The markets that pull it off, and thanks, Luis, for that question, and say Europe or North America, it's because they actually have very sophisticated financial markets that allow you to hedge these things one form or another. Latin America is only starting to develop those financial markets. Mexico might be a little more advanced than others, but they still have a long way to go. Just as a little bit of history, and you guys may well know this, if everyone here lives and breathes Latin American renewables, some 8 years ago, Chile had a couple projects that got built on 100% merchant risk. They had done their numbers, they crunched, and the spot price at that point was at like $150 a megawatt hour, right? Which is really tempting. And they ran is Chile, of course, is investment grade. It's a great place to do business. It has everything going right. And people crunched the numbers and said there's just no way that price from $150 average could drop to a point where we don't make money. It just couldn't happen. And I confessed that at the time, I also agreed, mind you. I read that stuff and I said, you know what? If you're gonna mess at any place in Latin America and experiment with merchant, Chile is the place to do it. Well, lo and behold, they built those projects and the perfect storm happened. The price of merchant just went to hell. It dropped like a stone. The thing that couldn't happen actually happened, and people lost serious amounts of money. So, and in Chile, mind you, so it's not like what's happening in some of the more difficult countries. Now, in places like Mexico, I think Luis was specifically asking about Mexico, there's increasingly amounts of merchant. You have to have a chunk of merchant out there because it's kind of the only way you can actually make your numbers work, right? The prices on those PPAs on the government auctions have gotten so low that you have to kind of bet a little bit, and bet might not be the best word, but it's actually the word I got to use right now, on having a piece of merchant risk, because that price historically, that price is historically higher, right? It makes it more attractive. The PPAs in Mexico also for energy have only been set up for 15 years, which now in retrospect turns out was too short. Those prices became in so low that banks are struggling to finance them because they need 17 or 18 years to pay off that debt. And so they're saying, well, we can finance for 15 years, but then those last 2-3 years of our financing are at risk. We have merchant risk kind of thing, we can't do it. And so therefore there's a whole new set of financial engineering you have to pull off to make everybody comfortable. So in short, having a component, a piece of merchant risk to your project is becoming commonplace. What percentage, I guess, is a function very much of what country you're in and what your individual investor's risk profile is. But it's a tough thing to calculate. It's one of the many variables that you need to set up and really think about and understand where you're getting into and what might happen to those merchant prices. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Stephen and Carlos, for your comprehensive answers. So we have even more questions coming in. Luckily, we have some time to answer a few of them. So one of the questions is whether North American investors look for projects ready to build in Latin America, or are they willing to invest in the development of engineering? The question comes from Antonio. Stephen, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. I probably can't talk directly about North American investors, but I suspect the investment market globally is very similar. And I'm afraid I'm going to give a slightly lawyer's answer, which is it depends. And it depends on a number of criteria, the first of which is how big the project is and what the risk appetite is. Most importantly, though, is the type of investor. Now, typically, I would not see funds and bank. Well, it'd be risky for banks to come in at construction stage, which I think is what the second limb of that question is getting at. Mostly because whilst the returns are obviously better because you have the financial uplift on construction, the risk of it not proceeding is too great for a fund that needs to match its liabilities, so it wouldn't be able to do it. What we are seeing, though, is the more family offices and smaller equity players, they are definitely coming in and doing solar in LATAM countries because the value jump is sufficient and it gets their yield and their internal rate of return sufficiently high. So we are definitely seeing equity investors coming in, normally after development stage, so the groundwork has been done in the sense of environmental consents and permits, but coming in at construction stage. And also what they're typically doing is getting a pipeline in place so that there's not just one investment, it's a series of investments. They link up with a local developer and are able to deliver a pipeline to their investors. And they effectively ring fence and get an exclusivity arrangement around those projects. And that means they can deploy significant amounts of their capital rather than have to go out and find each new project each time.
Yep. Well said. Actually, I can add this. Actually, I live in Texas. I live surrounded by Texans and here. So the North America, or specifically the U.S., has such an abundance of capital, and I would even argue that there's a surplus of capital these days, which is one of the reasons why returns keep getting lower and lower. Actually, it's because they're willing to accept these projects at these returns, given the imbalance between supply and demand in the projects. Now, specifically to answer your question, Antonio, there's so much capital in North America or the US that I see everything. We deal with investors who want to buy something that already has a PPA and it's ready to build, all the way to, hey, help me find a piece of land and we'll take it from there, and everything in between as well. Not only that, they often come in and saying, hey, we want something that's more or less ready to build. I'd say the sweet spot is like, hey, we want something that's pretty well cooked kind of thing, and then we'll figure out the PPA on our own if we participate in an auction or we find a private sector PPA. And once they end up looking and kicking the tires and trying to find out, oh, it turns out it's different investing in Chile versus Argentina, they're willing to actually accommodate that as well. So I don't see necessarily investors who are really set and saying, we know exactly what we want and nothing else will fit. I often see actually people willing to move along that spectrum a little bit to see if they can find the right deal. There are investors, of course, who are abundantly clear on what they want, and they just say, this is exactly what we want nothing more or nothing less. And of course, it's a pleasure to deal with those guys because they know what they want. They know the geographies, they know the risk, they know the size, they know what they're getting into. And it's easier to deal with clients who know the region and understand the risks they're getting into. Novice investors actually require a whole lot more hand-holding and are more likely to be disillusioned when Latin America behaves like Latin America, right? Which means it's an emerging market and things typically take longer than they should or they would anywhere else. But it's part of the risk. Thanks.
Right. Thank you very much once again. Next question is whether you have seen any issues that large-scale solar developers are having with local communities. Are they being consulted and engaged in the process? Has there been local opposition to solar development?
Well, if I can take this one briefly, just start. Yeah, given that historically this has been happening on the wind side, right? And so the issues were typically wherever the wind happened to be. The southern part of Chile, maybe, certainly the Oaxaca region in Mexico, where there's great wind, certain pockets within Central America. Now those same issues are kind of taking place on the solar side. I don't imagine that they would be any different than they were on the wind side. Land is land, and sometimes there are legitimate reasons. There are people say not in my backyard. So I don't see it being any different for solar now than it has been in wind. It's one of the ongoing things, and again, usually as you're developing a project, the sooner you address this stuff, you will be doing yourself a massive favor by looking into this topic and not assuming that you're going to get lucky and everyone's going to love you.
Yeah, I'd agree. I don't. So the experience we have, and this isn't directly because it tends to be on the ground, but the solar projects we're doing in Brazil, we have engaged with the locals, and we have not encountered any significant opposition. I think there's a recognition. It slightly depends on the site and location. Clearly, if you're going to remove agricultural land, that becomes more problematic. But solar tends to have a slightly better reputation than wind because of the visual impact. And actually, we haven't had any of our solar projects stopped as a result of local opposition.
Thank you very much. So, right, I think we have still have time to answer a few more questions. So, there is a question that has come up twice actually, and it's about developments of solar energy with batteries. So PV with batteries in LATAM. The first part of the question is, what are the challenges? And the second one is, where do you think those projects are more likely to take off first?
Yeah, I can talk to this to some extent. So we haven't seen that many batteries going in at the moment, but clearly there is a desire in the global market for projects to be co-located and hybrid projects which have storage alongside actually either wind or solar, and frankly any intermittent technology. The ability to de-risk that and provide storage next door, so there's pumping out the power at the relevant time, either from an arbitrage perspective, so that you take on power for free or at low cost and then pump it back in at higher cost. Clearly a model that works well and makes sense. What we are seeing though is people future-proofing their contracts. So what they're saying is, we will buy the land right, we'll put solar on there, but actually we want the ability at some point in the future to come back to you and talk to you about storage. And we're seeing that around the globe. We've seen it less in LATAM at the moment, but I can only see that as being a natural progression to hedge against it. And I think the question will then be the size of those storage projects co-locating with solar.
Yeah, perfect answer. Let me mention it this way. Again, solar storage, as I understand it, batteries, because it's a very broad topic here. We're talking about in use in combination with the intermittence, and again, we're talking then solar and wind, right? There's not always wind, there's not always sun. So in combination with that, again, let me keep it short here. The reason wind has been so much popular over solar in Latin America is because wind is perceived to be a lower technological risk. It's a more mature technology than solar. And so Latin America, we're a place that there's no shortage of risks generally. They don't want to tack onto that additional technology risk. That's why the region has historically favored wind. Well, the same applies to storage. Storage is still a nascent, it's still expensive, it's still, we're trying to find the right applications for it. And so the only existing storage capacity that's in Latin America is, guess where? Chile, of course, right? Mexico is looking at doing some stuff, and so is Brazil. But right now, Chile is the market because, again, it's the lowest risk country, and you can get away with maybe taking on a little bit more technology risk, which is what storage batteries actually represent. And then to wrap it up, there's a ton of applications for solar depending on where you want it to fit. I think what's going to happen in Latin America, where we're going to see it used mostly as an aid, as a buffer to the transmission lines. What's happening in transmission, and we're seeing this, for example, in Argentina and in Mexico, where the transmission grid, certain nodes are already at full capacity and they can't take on more. So if you actually add storage at these nodes as part of the transmission, you actually can maybe delay some additional investment in transmission and distribution. It buys you a little more time, so to speak. And that is likely to be the most common use of storage in Latin America. Not so much as part of an independent project, which is where you have a 50 megawatt solar thing with storage attached to it or something like that. That's a little bit more futuristic, I think, for Latin America.
Right, thank you very much. And well, we're coming towards the end, and we have time for one more question. And so far one question on the list, so it'd be probably the first time that we answer all the questions that we had, which is great, you know, and it's great how engaged the audience has been. It's been really good. So on the last question is on the Mexican market, and this person asks, how consolidated is the Mexican market at the moment, and one of the biggest investors in solar in this country? So I don't know who wants to go first.
Let me, Stephen. So you can wrap up the show. Mexico has the benefit of everyone is looking to get into Mexico, right? So we have the well-established developers and investors from Europe and from North America, very active, developing a bunch of projects in Mexico. It's a great market. We have the Desierto de Sonoran Desert up there with spectacular radiation as well. So you have all the pieces of the puzzle. Plus, it's Mexico. It's investment grade. The grid is pretty good. You can get access to financing. The Mexican development banks are getting pushed actually into by the government actually to also finance and provide project financing in Mexico. So you have all the big players. Just to drop one name, Enel Green Power has the single largest solar project in all of Latin America is in Mexico. It's I'm going by memory here, something like 700 megawatts or thereabouts. Actually, our firm actually did the engineering for it, so we're very close to it. But it's a doozy, and it reflects also that everyone's comfortable with Mexican risk.
Yeah, I'm afraid I don't have much to add to that. I don't have the data for how consolidated the Mexican market is at the moment. I obviously know of Enel Power and the size of them and the size of that project. The only thing I'd add is that we are seeing utilities funds looking at Mexico with a lot of interest. So I would see that market growing significantly, as Carlos alluded to earlier. But also there's a potential for the investors to change, and they're becoming increasingly international IPPs, and I think that would be quite an interesting movement as projects grow in size, both in terms of individual projects and the volume of the number of megawatts and gigawatts being produced out of that country.
Great. Well, Stephen, Carlos, and all of you who have joined us today, thank you very much for being here. And I think it's time to wrap up. As you know, the presentations and recordings will be available very soon. Probably within a week, you'll be able to access them, and we'll send them to you by email. And also, if you like this webinar and you like being on top of markets and knowing really what's going on, hearing it from the experts, go to our website, atainsights.com, and sign up to our upcoming webinars. So once again, thank you very much, Carlos, and thank you very much, Stephen.
Perfect.
And have a good day, all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen, for sharing the stage, and Carlos, great job moderating, and to the team behind you, behind the scenes. I know there's a bunch of people that have actually been working on this. Thank you so much, and to the audience as well. Thanks for the questions. Hasta luego.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Bye.